This beautiful day. It's really fantastic, isn't it? I think there are enough chairs for everybody to take a seat if you want to. I'm not sure how long Jerry might talk, you know, when you get him started. Actually,
here's my notes.
We are so excited to be presenting this exhibit to you all, and it'll be up through the 1st of April, or April 2nd, I think is our last day to have it on up here. So there's going to be a lot that you may want to come back for to really read about things and look at these maps and details. First of all, I'd like to thank the coordinators of this exhibit. Our education committee always works really hard on putting these together, and the coordinators for this exhibit have been Kim Waggart and Maureen Winkleman. Other members of the board for the Friends of the History Center are here. Can you guys wave? A lot of us are in look-alike outfits. Now, we can't claim to be surveyors, and I don't know what Jerry thinks about our outfits, but anyway, we're happy to see all of you here today and be happy to talk to you about the exhibit or about our organization, the Friends of the History Center. At this time, I'd like to ask Kim to introduce Jerry. This exhibit was really fun for us to put together, and we thank Jerry so much for loaning us his maps. You know that the name of the exhibit is A Surveyor's Maps of Aransas County. We also want to thank and acknowledge Tommy Griffith's daughter, Gail Garrett, who is here today. Her daddy, Tommy Griffith, was the county surveyor before Jerry, and Jerry will tell you some stories about that. And Gail says when you come inside to look at the exhibit, if you have any specific questions that you want to ask her, she'll be happy to answer them for you. So now I give you our county surveyor, Jerry Brundrett.
I know y'all were hoping for Donald Trump, but he's not here today. He's doing a Wounded Warriors program. But anyway, and started to address what Pam said about how she was dressed. You know, every good survey crew had to have some brushmen and axemen, and nobody really cared what they dressed like, as long as they could, you know, swing an axe and a machete. So thank y'all for coming today. I want to recognize my family. My wife, Marcia, is sitting next to Gail. My daughter, Bridget. My daughter, Brandy. My son, Brad. Where's Brad? Oh, he's in the back, and my son-in-law and daughter-in-law, and my grandkids. So, you know, I was afraid no one would show up, so I peppered the crowd with my family. And also, my favorite high school principal is here, Chester Borey. The reason I want to introduce Chester because he saw my notes, and he knew me from high school, and he was afraid I was going to talk for about 2 hours. But anyway, thank y'all for coming out today. And I do want to thank Cam Waggart and Maureen Winkleman and Pam Stranahan, who put together this exhibit, as well as the History Center Board and Pathways. Now, this is a venue of Pathways here, and we need to always remember that because they operate the venue tax, and all this wouldn't be possible without them. And so I want to start today and talk about, this is not about Jerry Brundrett and the county surveyor right now. This is about a history of Texas lands, a history of surveyors in Texas. and I want to tell some stories, and at the end I'm going to have a time for questions. So if I say something that you want to address later in the question, feel free to ask your question, because there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. Any discussion about the office of county surveyor is a discussion about the history of Texas and Texas lands and how it evolved into what we see today. A lot of y'all that maybe weren't many generations in Texas don't know this, but Texas has a very unique history, and I want to cover some of that today. The discussion is not about the person, but rather about the position of county surveyor since the founding of this county in 1871. So there's a lot of history that's in the county surveyor's office. Some of the stuff you see on the wall is just a fraction of thousands of documents that I have inside my office, inside a concrete vault to protect it from hurricanes and those type of things. So we feel very serious about protecting those records. We are in ourselves custodian of those historical records, and that's very important. It goes back to the very days of the Republic. And just to show you, since the county was founded in 1871, to my knowledge, I'm the 6th county surveyor in that many years. So it's not a position, most of the surveyors get in there and work till they die, and then they just, when they shrivel up, they use them for line stakes to mark a survey trail. I don't think there's very many of them in the cemetery because they're all planted out there as a survey stake. After Texas won its independence in 1836, it soon realized that they had no money to operate a government, right? They had all this land, but they had no money. So in 1838, the General Land Office was created to manage the vast acreage of the state of Texas. And just to show you, I think this is probably a plus or minus number, but when Texas became a republic, it had 176,266,000 acres of land. Now, so that was an awesome responsibility of how to get that land from the public domain into the private ownership. And this is what is the interesting part of surveying. And an old surveyor many years ago once said that how this happened was once described as being like the mosquito in the nudist colony. There are so many interesting points to touch upon. And when I try to talk about the history of surveying in Texas in short order, it's hard to do because it has such an interesting history, and there's so many things to point upon. A short history now. Since Aransas County was split off from Refugio County in 1871, the county surveyor's office has been filled by 6 surveyors. Frank Percival was an early surveyor that came here in around 1890. He came from England, he and his son Fred Percival. And Frank died in 1910, so Frank was pretty much the county surveyor up until that time, and then his son Fred Percival took over somewhere around 1910, and then he surveyed. Somewhere after Percival, a man by the name of Floyd Huffman was county surveyor. I think it may have only been for maybe one term, either 2 or 4 year term, and then Mr. Huffman left town and took all his records with him. Tommy and I for years tried to find those records, and we were told they had been destroyed. That when he left town, he was so upset that he destroyed all of his records. Our office has all of the historic records of the county surveyors except Floyd Huffman. After Huffman was James Jarboe. Now, James Jarboe, he died in 1961, and James, I don't know if the story, I haven't validated the story or not, but it said that James Jarboe ran against Floyd Huffman for county surveyor and won by 1 vote because Jarboe's wife voted for him and Huffman's wife didn't vote. So I don't know, Chester may know if that's true or not, but that's a tough way to win an election. Anyway, and then after Jarboe, Tommy Griffith was actually working with Jarboe prior to Jarboe dying, and then he assumed the office of county surveyor. Now, I can tell you that I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Tommy Griffith, and I sure wouldn't know what I know about the history of land titles and land ownership in this county if it wasn't for Tommy Griffith. I had the pleasure of, I think, spending, I don't know if it's 18 to 25 years with Tommy before he passed away. And Tommy tried very hard to make sure that I knew not only everything good, but everything bad about land ownership, land title. And that's what the county surveyors is. It's a perpetuation and a continuation of the knowledge of the property in your county and surrounding areas that's passed on from surveyor to surveyor. The guys that come in from out of town, all they have in their hand is a map, but they don't know how that map was prepared, whether or not you can trust it, whether or not it was fictitious. And so that's where the continuation of the county surveyor's office is important. So I'm the 6th county surveyor that's been in that office. Before, from 1838 until the county was founded, the General Land Office appointed what we call district surveyors, because they had to disperse this vast amount of land, and they were appointed by the General Land Office to survey these public lands to put them in private ownership. That's a whole story in itself as to how that the state of Texas divested themselves of roughly that 176 million acres of land. But what's interesting about that history is that early surveyors were paid about $3 a mile for the work they did. Thank you, Dan. And so if you were going to survey a river league, you made maybe $39 to conduct that survey. Well, that's a little bit less than what we make today, but anyway, it wasn't much of an incentive to be a surveyor, even back in the early 1900s and late 1800s. That wasn't a whole lot of money because you had to pay all your personnel from that also. But in the unsettled country, it was a very dangerous profession. And this is a story that until I started doing a little bit more research, I didn't realize. The Comanche Indians hated land surveyors. They literally hated them. And they hated the compass that they used to lay out the land. And the Indians would call the surveyor's compass the thing that steals the land, because they knew that when the surveyor showed up with the compass, that they would soon be driven off their land. And so they called the compass the thing that steals the land. And it was not uncommon in that period of time to come along a horrible scene of a wrecked surveyor's camp with dead and scalped surveyors all over the place, because the Indians made sure to discourage other surveyors from even coming into the area. And you will see in the exhibit a picture of an early survey party. It should be in there somewhere on the wall, that the surveyors always had their Colt 45 and their rifle close by, because many times as they conducted these surveys, they would come under Indian attack and they would have to fight their way out. And usually they would go back to the office and pencil whip the survey so they wouldn't have to deal with the Indians. That's why, if you wonder today why so many tracts of land are questionable, it's because, it was a hostile environment to survey in. A few stories that I want to tell that I think are quite colorful. There's a story of an early Spanish surveyor who he would back his pony up to the survey mark, and he would generally head his pony in a northerly direction, and he would just dig his spurs into the side of the pony, and the pony would just start walking in a trot, and he would count every time the pony's right foot hit the ground. And after so many steps, he would tie a knot in a piece of leather, and once he had the appropriate number of knots, he would get out and he would set a monument and he would turn that horse roughly 90 degrees and then start measuring the next course. So that's how the Spanish did some of their surveys. Another early surveyor used a wagon because he didn't want to ride his pony. And on the wagon, he would back it up to the point. He would tie a rag on a wheel of the wagon. He knew the circumference of the wheel, so he would just giddy up and he would count the revolutions until he got to where he wanted, and then he could set the monument. One story that Fred Percival told Tommy, and Tommy passed on to me, which is some of that wisdom from Mr. Griffith that that I'll always remember. He said, "Son, don't survey around White Point. White Point is over there sort of west of Portland on the bluff." And Tommy said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, early on my dad and I were surveying some tracts of land over there for George H. Paul and Coleman Fulton lands, and we broke our 66-foot surveyor's chain, and we were going to have to send it back to St. Louis to be repaired. So before we sent it back, we carefully laid down a piece of barbed wire, and it could have been a piece of just smooth wire, because Chester said, I bet that was hard to pull through the brush, and Chester's right. It might have been a piece of smooth wire that they used back then." And they carefully measured it, and they sent their chain off. Well, a couple months later, when they got their repaired chain back, they laid it down to compare against the barbed wire, and the barbed wire had stretched about a foot. So he said, all those surveys over in White Point are every 100 feet, every 66 feet, we were off a foot. So you can imagine, you know, what confusion that created. There was also, sometime in the late 1800s, I think it was around 1890, there was a district surveyor's report of the original grants or abstracts of land in Aransas County, where he went he went down and get another drink. I'm not Marco Rubio, because he does that a lot too. He wrote this report about all these original surveys, and basically he said that a lot of them were almost fictitious. Most of the early surveys in this county began in a stake on the shoreline. But you can imagine, after all the hurricanes we've had from the 1800s, that shoreline has migrated, and definitely that stake is gone. So when you're trying to retrace these old surveys, it's very difficult. But one in particular, they were calling in these field notes of the Joseph Fessington survey, which is out west of town, west of 1781, that goes out around what's now Cape Valero. And when it got to like the southwest corner of the Joseph Fessington, it called for some bearing trees, which was not uncommon in that period of time. They would have a monument like a boat arch stake, and then they would call for bearing trees, usually about 3 of them, so they could recover that stake. But the bearing trees were like 6 and 8 inch live oak trees. Well, anybody that have lived around here very long knows that there never has been and there never will be a live oak tree that size out in the marsh, in the mudflats. So obviously it was a fictitious description, and he probably came under Indian attack and decided to go ahead and pencil whip the thing. The Office of County Survey, I want to talk a little bit about it. The office was first appointed by Congress under the Republic of Texas Constitution in 1845. And it had some duties which are still in effect today, although most of them are antiquated. But a lot of them still are, like examining and recording field notes of original surveys where there's vacancies and surveys that have to go to the General Land Office. The county surveyor has to examine them, the plats and field notes, and certify it to them. And those records and those original survey record books are in my office, in my vault. But they contain the original field notes of the original surveys in this county. They also required us to maintain an accurate unit of measurement and one of bearing. And the purpose for that was so that farmers and ranchers could come in back then and they could lay down their lariat rope that they used to measure their land or their fields, and they would calibrate their lariat rope based on the unit of measurement. And they also, if they had a compass, they could calibrate their compass. So those are some of the antiquated duties. Most of them, as I said, are obsolete today. County surveyors are elected now for 4-year terms and are supposed to receive $1 a year, because we're not, even though we're elected and we have a county title, we're not salaried to the county. All of our records, our equipment, our vehicles, our personnel, everything is all owned privately by the county surveyor. I've been working in the county surveyor's office for 38 years, 20 of those years elected county surveyor, and at least 18 of those years, and even longer, working with Mr. Griffith, who Gail and I actually worked together. And a little interesting story there, Gail was always ready if we were short-handed to jump in and help out in those early days. And we were surveying a little tract of land over there, around Lago Vista, a little Lago Vista subdivision. We were walking down this line, and we saw we thought the biggest rattlesnake we had ever seen was laying right across the Sendera. And of course she sort of panicked, and I said, well, what do you want to do? Actually, what it was 2 rattlesnakes that were mating, and it made it look like a real long rattlesnake. And she said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we're going to try to swing around it and not disturb them. They're having too much fun, so I don't want to disturb them. So that's what we did, and we went on with our survey. You know, one of the advantages, and this is where it gets a little serious about the office, it's not a political office. I can make fun of political on both sides because we're not a political office. No one's fighting to be elected to this job because it doesn't pay anything, and you have to own all your stuff. You have to have an office, the equipment, and everything I mentioned earlier. And if we do work for the county, which we do a lot of work for them, we bill them like we would any other customer. The real benefit is the accumulation of knowledge of local boundaries and ownership that's passed down from county surveyor to county surveyor. And as I stated earlier, Mr. Griffith, from the first time we got together, he trained me to be where I am today. And I'm hoping between my daughters and my son, and hopefully someday my grandson, is maybe train them so that they can take over. And I was really blessed to have Tommy as a mentor, because not only was he a good surveyor, he was an honorable person, and he was involved in all kind of community affairs. Gail told me a story I forgot. He was one of the founding directors of the ABC school, and he loved to get donuts, and he would go down to ABC school probably almost daily, if not several times a week, and give kids donuts at ABC school. One time, Gail and Tommy were in HEB or somewhere, and some little boy told his mom, Mommy, there's the donut man. So the county surveyor may also be the donut man too. So you know, that's a little interesting story, and I'm very indebted to Tommy for all of the knowledge that he passed on to me. As I said, my oldest daughter Brandy is here. She's a civil engineer. Bridget is a registered land surveyor, and my son is working on his surveyor's license. So hopefully they will continue the business. We work not only with the county government, but we also work with the cities, navigation district, mud districts, and a lot of what we do is a resource of what happened in the county and what are we going to do about it. And you know, quite often I get a call from Judge Mills, and Judge doesn't say a whole lot. He speaks in few words, but he said, Jerry, I need a history lesson, because when you've been in with county for 37 years, there's a lot of things you learn that probably you wish you didn't know, but I try to keep them abreast of how we got in the situation that we're in, how roads got in the wrong place, how things really got messed up. You know, one thing I thought many times what a surveyor is, and I said a surveyor lives with 1 foot in the past, which is the history, 1 foot in the present, which is the present, but we've always got our eyes on the future, because what we do today impacts what happens in the future. And thank goodness there aren't Comanche Indians around today, because I wouldn't want to be the person or in the instrument that steals the land. A surveyor is a mixed breed of historian, treasure hunter, problem solver, Indian fighter, sometimes referee, a lot of times explorer, and maybe even sometimes lawyers, because you would be amazed how many attorneys get involved in land title disputes and they rely on the surveyor to actually keep them going in the right direction, because they understand the law, but sometimes they don't understand the surveying part of it. I believe that the surveyor, whether it's a he or she, is born to be a surveyor. It's not a career that you just wake up and say, okay, I think I'm going to do that. It's almost a calling, because you have to be those things I mentioned above to be successful at it, or you don't stay there. There's a lot easier ways to make a living, I can promise you. It's hard work, it has long hours, and you have to love the land, and you have to care about private land ownership. If you don't, you shouldn't be in that position. And I almost, it grieves me deeply when people come in and I try to help them through situations where I feel like somebody's trying to grab their land or treat them unfairly. Because I think land ownership is a right given by God, you know, to own land. It goes back to the early Egyptian days when the pharaohs would have, because the Nile would flood every year, they would monument their boundaries so they could reconstruct those boundaries after the Nile flooded. So it's a right that goes back way into biblical times. And I think it's the duty of the county surveyor in their local county to preserve those rights, not only for the public ownership, but the private ownership. When the puzzle is hard, we have to solve it, and you just have to work harder until all the pieces fit together. And I remember one thing that Tommy and I were doing years ago that involved all the property down on the waterfront that's called Rockport Harborfront, all that waterfront south of the turning basin. And it's where 2 original abstracts or patents come together called the T.T. Williamson patents. I think it's 35 and 36. And when you read the description, it calls the common corner to be an old buggy axle set in a flour barrel of concrete. And that was the beginning point. And we were doing that survey on the Rockport Harborfront property where you have an ownership between the upland owner and the navigation district. So we had to retrace that boundary line, and we had to find that barrel of concrete with the buggy axle in it. So I went out there. Tommy gave me all the information he knew, and we researched the old records, and I went out there and I thought, well, I knew within maybe 5-foot diameter of where it was. So I took my shovel and we started digging. It's on that property that used to be Jackson Seafood Jackson Trust. The dirt was very compacted. He had put mud shell on it. Heavy equipment had run over it. I mean, it was like digging with a shovel in concrete. And we dug and we dug. We got down about 4 foot deep, a big enough hole that I was standing down in it digging, and I just wouldn't give up. We spent a half a day digging for that buggy axle, and there I hit a 4-inch electrical conduit where Mr. Jackson had run an electrical conduit to one of his big motors. And I just knew that the backhoe had got the buggy axle and we weren't going to find it. And I got out of the hole and I was really frustrated, you know, and I said, no, I'm going to make one more attempt. And I took the shovel and I went underneath that conduit, because when I was digging, I was looking at the coloration of the dirt, and I could tell that a lot of that dirt was artificial fill. So when I got down to what looked like to me natural ground, it was underneath the conduit. And I thought, well, that thing might be a little deeper. So I took a shovel and started digging under that conduit, and I hit something. And I reached my hand underneath it, and I could feel the square nut on the top of that old buggy axle. Now, that's perseverance, because most people would have given up and walked away, and I couldn't do it. You know, I had to find that corner because I was fixing to do a survey that everything had to be based on that corner. Well, after we found it, we carefully transferred the position above the conduit, and I got we surveyed in on it. I got a good position, tied it down to the breakwater. So now, for the rest of history, I know where that buggy axle is. And I could tell you many, many stories. I'm like that mosquito flying around. There's so many things that are interesting to touch upon. You know, I've talked a lot, and I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. All of this other stuff is just backup in case I don't know the answer and don't feel like I can make it up and convince you. I'll probably refer to my notes. But in closing, I thought it might be good, you know, to open it up to questions. And maybe there's something that the mosquito touched upon today that that y'all have an interest in. And I would like to open it up now. And then after we finish this, then everyone's free to have refreshments and maybe go inside and look at the exhibit. I'll be around there if you have more questions. We can talk about them then. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time. And don't feel like, you know, there's no question that is too embarrassing to ask. Yes, ma'am. When am I going to write a book? Everybody tells me that. You know, a little bit about the history of our family. We go back in this county prior to 1845 on the Brundridge side, and even where my office is located, it came through the Smith side of the family, and we've been on that property since about 1878. So there's so much in my family history. There's so much in surveying history. You know, I don't know if I would live long enough to try to get everything down on paper. Did anybody somebody else had another question?
Tell us about the protection of the records.
Well, and Chester and I were talking about this because he feels the same way, that, you know, it's the duty and responsibility of all of us that are interested in history to protect all of these historical records. That's why I spend a considerable amount of money building my office and putting that big concrete vault in there to protect those records, because it grieved my spirit every time a hurricane was coming into the Gulf, and I thought that those records might blow away in a tornado or a storm. And it's not only surveying records, it's the reason this History Center is here today, and the reason all these ladies and men that work on the board work so hard, is because we want to preserve those records so that our grandkids, great-grandkids,